Hi, I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, with your update for the final day of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. Today we heard the evidence of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to bring the factual phase of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings to a close. At this point, we've already heard from the police, the protesters, residents, city councillors, and other city officials, members of the RCMP, the OPP, the OPS, Windsor Police, officials from Coutts and Windsor, federal ministers, and it concludes with the man at the top of the decision, the Prime Minister himself. Several big points came out of the Prime Minister's testimony today. I'll start with his examination in chief. He concluded his examination with a surprising point. He said, "I'm not going to pretend that this couldn't have been done any other way, but it got the job done," in reference to the Emergencies Act. The Emergency Act requires that the emergency cannot be resolved by any other law of Canada. The Prime Minister, in his wrapping up his examination in chief, basically just admitted that he could have done it otherwise. He was also cross-examined. So turning to the cross-examinations, there were several great cross-examinations that brought out very important points. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association cross-examined him and pressed him on the definition of a threat to security of Canada under the CSIS Act. We've heard about this a lot now, and it's a core to whether or not the invocation of the Emergency Act was justified. So in his examination in chief, he did give his explanation of why he thinks the definition was met, and he says it has a broader meaning in the CSIS Act because there's a different context. He says there's a different decision maker, namely the Governor General and Council, as opposed to CSIS, and there's a different purpose. It's addressing an emergency instead of deciding whether or not CSIS can launch an investigation, and so that context justifies a higher threshold. But coming to the conclusion of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association cross-examination, he was asked whether given that the importance of the Emergency Act is to set a standard and to protect the abuse of power, whether it shouldn't have a lower threshold, but rather the same level of protection that the CSIS Act has, he was asked if the scope of the definition of threat to the security of Canada in the CSIS Act has the same threshold as the Emergencies Act, and he said yes. Again, going counter to this idea that we've heard up to now that there was somehow a broader meaning. Following that, my colleague Rob Kittredge cross-examined the Prime Minister, and his cross-examination focused on one very big point, which is the late disclosure of documents. The issue has been raised, especially in the last week leading up to today, and this just goes to highlight the issue that has been apparent. So there was a document which was redacted. The redaction was ordered by the Commissioner. The Counsel for the Government of Canada resisted the redaction, but then ultimately was ordered to make that redaction and released it at 10:30 today. An hour into the Prime Minister's testimony, already having begun. It was the notes of one of the witnesses we heard yesterday, Brian Clow, and there was a specific line that was redacted as being irrelevant, but that redaction was removed. Even though the Commissioner's order actually pertained to parliamentary privilege, so in the scope of in the process of removing those redactions, this was taken out as well, and it revealed behind it a note that the Americans were offering tow trucks. Tow trucks have been a big part of this commission that we've heard. It's one of the main things that officials have been able to point to as a power that they needed that they had to invoke the Emergency Act in order to be able to do. And this goes to show that the Americans were offering tow trucks, and that fact was hidden for 6 weeks after hearing about tow trucks. That fact was hidden until an hour into the final witness's evidence. And that point was wonderfully amplified because my colleague, Mr. Kittredge, was followed by counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, who asked the Prime Minister about a statement he'd made earlier. So CSIS had prepared an assessment, and earlier the Prime Minister said we should read the assessment ourselves. And so Mr. Chowdhury for the CCF put it to him and showed the document. And in dramatic fashion, as it scrolled up, we see page after page of full redactions, the whole page blacked out. We can't read it. And in fact, the Prime Minister acknowledged that he didn't read it. And to cap off the great cross-examinations, Eva Chipiuk for the Freedom Convoy organizers gave an emotional cross-examination. First, cross-examining the Prime Minister on the refusal to follow through on the deal that had been negotiated by the city. He was briefed on the deal at the Incident Response Group meeting on Sunday, the February 13th. The next day, they revoked the Emergencies Act and police end the deal. And then Ms. Chipiuk then went into reading some excerpts from some of the stories that protesters had put forward about the way in which they had been hurt by the government throughout the whole COVID response, and then the way in which the protest was this wonderful release where they were able to stand side by side with their fellow citizens. And then she concluded with the question, when did you become afraid of your people? To which he answered, of course, that he was not afraid of his people, but certainly a powerful point to put to the Prime Minister after everything we've heard about the declaration of emergency. So that is the dramatic final day to the factual phase of the Public Order Emergency Commission hearings. So after this, there's going to be a week of policy phase where there's going to be different panels discussing some of the issues that we've heard about from a policy perspective in terms of coming up with recommendations for the government going forward. Submissions are going to be received. So today we heard very short 5-minute closing statements, but the parties are going to submit fuller, more detailed closing submissions, which will be made publicly available. And then at the end of the day, the commissioner is going to have to write a report which will be submitted to Parliament in February. Under the Emergencies Act, the government has 360 days from the declaration of emergency to provide that report, when we will see the findings that are the product of everything we've heard up until now. So that brings a close. This is going to be my last video update. It's been a lot of fun, a very educational experience, and certainly very illuminating, as we've seen many powerful people put under the powerful lens of cross-examination in order to get to the bottom of what happened and why it happened. Thanks. I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center. Take care.